Mabel, a short story by SOMERSET MAUG. I was at Pagan in Burma, and from there I took the steamer to Mandalay, but a couple of days before I got there, when the boat tied up for the night at a riverside village, I made up my mind to go ashore. The skipper told me that there was there a pleasant little club in which I had only to make myself at home. They were quite used to having strangers drop off like that from the steamer, and the secretary was a very decent chap. I might even get a game of bridge. I had nothing in the world to do, so I got into one of the bullock carts that were waiting at the landing stage and was driven to the club. There was a man sitting on the veranda, and as I walked up, he nodded to me and asked whether I would have a whiskey and soda or a gin and bitters. The possibility that I would have nothing at all did not even occur to him. I chose the longer drink and sat down. He was a tall, thin, bronzed man with a big moustache, and he wore khaki shorts and a khaki shirt. I never knew his name. But when we had been chatting a little while, another man came in who told me he was the secretary, and he addressed my friend as George. "Have you heard from your wife yet?" he asked him. The other's eyes brightened. "Yes, I had letters by this mail. She's having no end of a time." "Did she tell you not to fret?" George gave a little chuckle, but was I mistaken in thinking that there was in it the shadow of a sob? In point of fact, she did, but that's easier said than done. Of course, I know she wants a holiday, and I'm glad she should have it, but it's devilish hard on a chap. He turned to me. "You see, this is the first time I've ever been separated from my missus, and I'm like a lost dog without her." "How long have you been married?" 5 minutes. The secretary of the club laughed. "Don't be a fool, George. You've been married 8 years. After we had talked for a little, George, looking at his watch, said he must go and change his clothes for dinner and left us. The secretary watched him disappear into the night with a smile of not unkindly irony. "We all ask him as much as we can now that he's alone," he told me. "He mopes so terribly since his wife went home. It must be very pleasant for her to know that her husband is as devoted to her as all that. Mabel is a remarkable woman." He called the boy and ordered more drinks. In this hospitable place, they did not ask you if you would have anything. They took it for granted. Then he settled himself in his long chair and lit a cheroot. He told me the story of George and Mabel. They became engaged when he was home on leave, and when he returned to Burma, it was arranged that she should join him in 6 months. But one difficulty cropped up after another. Mabel's father died, the war came, George was sent to a district unsuitable for a white woman, so that in the end, it was 7 years before she was able to start. He made all arrangements for the marriage, which was to take place on the day of her arrival, and went down to Rangoon to meet her. On the morning on which the ship was due, he borrowed a motor car and drove along to the dock. He paced the quay. Then suddenly, without warning, his nerve failed him. He had not seen Mabel for 7 years. He had forgotten what she was like. She was a total stranger. He felt a terrible sinking in the pit of his stomach, and his knees began to wobble. He couldn't go through with it. He must tell Mabel that he was very sorry, but he couldn't. He really couldn't marry her. But how could a man tell a girl a thing like that when she had been engaged to him for 7 years and had come 6,000 miles to marry him? He hadn't the nerve for that either. George was seized with the courage of despair. There was a boat at the quay on the very point of starting for Singapore. He wrote a hurried letter to Mabel, and without a stick of luggage, just in the clothes he stood up in, leaped on board. The letter Mabel received ran somewhat as follows. "Dearest Mabel, I have been suddenly called away on business and do not know when I shall be back. I think it would be much wiser if you returned to England. My plans are very uncertain. Your loving George." But when he arrived at Singapore, he found a cable waiting for him. Quite understand. "Don't worry. Love. Mabel." Terror made him quick-witted. "By Jove, I believe she's following me," he said. He telegraphed to the shipping office at Rangoon, and sure enough her name was on the passenger list of the ship that was now on its way to Singapore. There was not a moment to lose. He jumped on the train to Bangkok, but he was uneasy. She would have no difficulty in finding out that he had gone to Bangkok, and it was just as simple for her to take the train as it had been for him. Fortunately, there was a French tramp sailing next day for Saigon. He took it. At Saigon, he would be safe. It would never occur to her that he had gone there, and if it did, surely by now she would have taken the hint. It is 5 days' journey from Bangkok to Saigon, and the boat is dirty, cramped, and uncomfortable. He was glad to arrive and took a rickshaw to the hotel. He signed his name in the visitor's book, and a telegram was immediately handed to him. It contained but 2 words: love. Mabel. They were enough to make him break into a cold sweat. "When is the next boat for Hong Kong?" he asked. Now his flight grew serious. He sailed to Hong Kong, but dared not stay there. He went to Manila. Manila was ominous. He went on to Shanghai. Shanghai was nerve-wracking. Every time he went out of the hotel, he expected to run straight into Mabel's arms. No, Shanghai would never do. The only thing was to go to Yokohama. At the Grand Hotel at Yokohama, a cable awaited him. "So sorry to have missed you at Manila. Love, Mabel." He scanned the shipping intelligence with a fevered brow. Where was she now? He doubled back to Shanghai. This time, he went straight to the club and asked for a telegram. It was handed to him. "Arriving shortly. Love. Mabel." No, he was not so easy to catch as all that. He had already made his plans. The Yangtze is a long river, and the Yangtze was falling. He could just about catch the last steamer that could get up to Chungking, and then no one could travel till the following spring except by junk. Such a journey was out of the question for a woman alone. He went to Hankow, and from Hankow to Yichang. He changed boats here, and from Yichang through the rapids went to Chungking. But he was desperate now. He was not going to take any risks. There was a place called Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan, and it was 400 miles away. It could only be reached by road, and the road was infested with brigands. A man would be safe there. George collected chair bearers and coolies and set out. It was with a sigh of relief that he saw at last the crenellated walls of the lonely Chinese city. From those walls at sunset, you could see the snowy mountains of Tibet. He could rest at last. Mabel would never find him there. The consul happened to be a friend of his, and he stayed with him. He enjoyed the comfort of a luxurious house. He enjoyed his idleness after that strenuous escape across Asia, and above all, he enjoyed his divine security. The weeks passed lazily, one after the other. One morning, George and the consul were in the courtyard looking at some curios that a Chinese had brought for their inspection when there was a loud knocking at the great door of the consulate. The doorman flung it open. A chair borne by 4 coolies entered, advanced, and was set down. Mabel stepped out. She was neat and cool and fresh. There was nothing in her appearance to suggest that she had just come in after a fortnight on the road. George was petrified. He was as pale as death. She went up to him. "Hello, George. I was so afraid I'd missed you again." "Hello, Mabel," he faltered. He did not know what to say. He looked this way and that. She stood between him and the doorway. She looked at him with a smile in her blue eyes. "You haven't altered at all," she said. "Men can go off so dreadfully in 7 years, and I was afraid you'd got fat and bald. I've been so nervous. It would have been terrible if after all these years I simply hadn't been able to bring myself to marry you after all." She turned to George's host. "Are you the consul?" she asked. "I am." "That's all right. I'm ready to marry him as soon as I've had a bath." And she did. Behind the Scenes, a short story by SOMERSET MAUG. When Ashenden was sent to X and looked about him, he could not but see that his situation was equivocal. X was the capital of an important belligerent state, but a state divided against itself. There was a large party antagonistic to the war, and revolution was possible, if not imminent. Ashenden was instructed to see what, under the circumstances, could best be done. He was to suggest a policy and, if it was approved by the exalted personages who had sent him, to carry it out. A vast amount of money was put at his disposal. The ambassadors of Great Britain and the United States had been directed to afford him such facilities as were at their command, but Ashenden had been told privately to keep himself to himself. He was not to make difficulties for the official representatives of the two powers by divulging to them facts that it might be inconvenient for them to know. And since it might be necessary for him to give support undercover to a party that was at daggers drawn with that in office, and with which the relations of the United States and Great Britain were extremely cordial, it was just as well that Ashenden should keep his own counsel. The exalted personages did not wish the ambassadors to suffer the affront of discovering that an obscure agent had been sent to work at cross purposes with them. On the other hand, it was thought just as well to have a representative in the opposite camp, who in the event of a sudden upheaval would be at hand with adequate funds and in the confidence of the new leaders of the country. But ambassadors are sticklers for their dignity, and they have a keen nose to scent any encroachment on their authority. When Ashenden, on his arrival at X, paid an official call on Sir Herbert Witherspoon, the British ambassador, he was received with a politeness to which no exception could be taken, but with a frigidity that would have sent a little shiver down the spine of a polar bear. Sir Herbert was a diplomat de carrière, and he cultivated the manner of his profession to a degree that filled the observer with admiration. He did not ask Ashenden anything about his mission because he knew that Ashenden would reply evasively, but he allowed him to see that it was a perfectly foolish one. He talked with acidulous tolerance of the exalted personages who had sent Ashenden to X. He told Ashenden that he had instructions to meet any demands for help that he made, and stated that if Ashenden at any time desired to see him, he had only to say so. I have received the somewhat singular request to dispatch telegrams for you in a private code, which I understand has been given to you, and to hand over to you telegrams in code as they arrive. I hope they will be few and far between, sir, answered Ashenden. I know nothing so tedious as coding and decoding. Sir Herbert paused for an instant. Perhaps that was not quite the answer he expected. He rose. If you will come into the Chancellery, I will introduce you to the Councillor and to the Secretary, to whom you can take your telegrams. Ashenden followed him out of the room, and after handing him over to the Councillor, the ambassador gave him a limp hand to shake. I hope I shall have the pleasure of seeing you again one of these days, he said, and with a curt nod, left him. Ashenden bore his reception with composure. It was his business to remain in obscurity, and he did not wish any official attentions to attract notice to him. But when on the afternoon of the same day he made his call at the American embassy, he discovered why Sir Herbert Witherspoon had shown him so much coldness. The American ambassador was Mr. Wilbur Schaefer. He came from Kansas City and had been given his post when few suspected that a war was on the point of breaking out as a reward for political services. He was a big, stout man, no longer young, for his hair was white, but well preserved and exceedingly robust. He had a square, red face, clean-shaven, with a little snub nose and a determined chin. His face was very mobile, and he twisted it continually into odd and amusing grimaces. It looked as though it were made out of the red India rubber from which they make hot water botties. He greeted Ashenden with cordiality. He was a hearty fellow. I suppose you've seen Sir Herbert. I reckon you've got his dander up. What do they mean in Washington and London by telling us to dispatch your code telegrams without knowing what they're all about? You know, they've got no right to do that." "Oh, Your Excellency, I think it was only done to save time and trouble," said Ashenden. "Well, what is this mission anyway?" And this, of course, was a question that Ashenden was not prepared to answer, but not thinking it polite to say so, he determined to give a reply from which the ambassador could learn little. He had already made up his mind from the look of him that Mr. Schaefer, though doubtless possessed of the gifts that enable a man to swing a presidential election this way or that, had not, at least nakedly for all men to see, the acuteness that his position perhaps demanded. He gave you the impression of a bluff, good-humored creature who liked good cheer. Ashenden would have been wary when playing poker with him, but where the matter in hand was concerned, felt himself fairly safe. He began to talk in a loose, vague way of the world at large, and before he had gone far, managed to ask the ambassador his opinion of the general situation. It was the sound of the trumpet to the war horse. Mr. Schaefer made him a speech that lasted without a break for 25 minutes, and when at last he stopped in exhaustion, Ashenden, with warm thanks for his friendly reception, was able to take his leave. Making up his mind to give both the ambassadors a wide berth, he set about his work and presently devised a plan of campaign. But by chance, he was able to do Sir Herbert Witherspoon a good turn, and so was thrown again into contact with him. It has been suggested that Mr. Schaefer was more of a politician than a diplomat, and it was his position rather than his personality that gave weight to his opinions. He looked upon the eminence to which he had risen as an opportunity to enjoy the good things of life, and his enthusiasm led him to lengths that his constitution could ill support. His ignorance of foreign affairs would in any case have made his judgment of doubtful value, but his state at meetings of the Allied ambassadors so often approached the comatose that he seemed hardly capable of forming a judgment at all. He was known to have succumbed to the fascination of a Swedish lady of undoubted beauty, but of antecedents that from the point of view of a Secret Service agent were suspect. Her relations with Germany were such as to make her sympathy with the Allies dubious. Mr. Schaefer saw her every day and was certainly much under her influence. Now it was noticed that there was from time to time a leakage of very secret information, and the question arose whether Mr. Schaefer did not, in these daily interviews, inadvertently say things that were promptly passed on to the headquarters of the enemy. No one could have doubted Mr. Schaefer's honesty and patriotism, but it was permissible to be uncertain of his discretion. It was an awkward matter to deal with, but the concern was as great in Washington as in London and Paris, and Ashenden was instructed to deal with it. He had, of course, not been sent to X without help to do the work he was expected to do, and among his assistants was an astute, powerful, and determined man, a Galician Pole named Herbatus. After consultation with him, it happened by one of those fortunate coincidences that occasionally come about in the Secret Service that a maid in the service fell ill, and in her place the Countess, for such she was very luckily able to engage an extremely respectable person from the neighborhood of Krakow. The fact that before the war she had been secretary to an eminent scientist made her doubtless no less competent a housemaid. The result of this was that Ashenden received every 2 or 3 days a neat report on the goings-on at this charming lady's apartment, and though he learned nothing that could confirm the vague suspicions that had arisen, he learned something else of no little importance. From conversations held at the cozy little tete-a-tete dinners that the Countess gave the ambassador, it appeared that His Excellency was harboring a bitter grievance against his English colleague. He complained that the relations between himself and Sir Herbert were deliberately maintained on a purely official level. In his blunt way, he said he was sick of the frills that damned Britisher put on. He was a he-man and 100% American, and he had no more use for protocol and etiquette than for a snowball in hell. Why didn't they get together, like a couple of regular fellows, and have a good old crack? Blood was thicker than water, he'd say, and they'd do more towards winning the war by sitting down in their shirt sleeves and talking things out over a bottle of rye than by all their diplomacy and white spats. Now it was obviously very undesirable that there should not exist between the two ambassadors a perfect cordiality, so Ashenden thought it well to ask Sir Herbert whether he might see him. He was ushered into Sir Herbert's library. "Well, Mr. Ashenden, what can I do for you? I hope you're quite satisfied with everything. I understand that you've been keeping the telegraph lines busy." Ashenden, as he sat down, gave the ambassador a glance. He was beautifully dressed in a perfectly cut tailcoat that fitted his slim figure like a glove. In his black silk tie was a handsome pearl. There was a perfect line in his grey trousers, with their quiet and distinguished stripe, and his neat, pointed shoes looked as though he had never worn them before. You could hardly imagine him sitting in his shirt sleeves over a whiskey highball. He was a tall, thin man, with exactly the figure to show off modern clothes, and he sat in his chair, rather upright, as though he were sitting for an official portrait. In his cold and uninteresting way, he was really a very handsome fellow. His neat grey hair was parted on one side, his pale face was clean-shaven, he had a delicate straight nose and grey eyes under grey eyebrows. His mouth in youth might have been sensual and well-shaped, but now it was set to an expression of sarcastic determination, and the lips were pallid. It was the kind of face that suggested centuries of good breeding, but you could not believe it capable of expressing emotion. You would never expect to see it break into the hearty distortion of laughter, but at the most be for a moment moved by an ironic smile. Ashenden was uncommonly nervous. "I'm afraid you'll think I'm meddling in what doesn't concern me, sir. I'm quite prepared to be told to mind my own business." "We'll see. Pray go on." Ashenden told his story, and the ambassador listened attentively. He did not turn his cold grey eyes from Ashenden's face, and Ashenden knew that his embarrassment was obvious. "How did you find out all this?" "I have means of getting hold of little bits of information that are sometimes useful," said Ashenden. "I see." Sir Herbert maintained his steady gaze, but Ashenden was surprised to see on a sudden, in the steely eyes, a little smile. The bleak, supercilious face became for an instant quite attractive. "There is another little bit of information that perhaps you'd be good enough to give me. What does one do to be a regular fellow?" "I'm afraid one can do nothing, Your Excellency," replied Ashenden gravely. "I think it is a gift of God." The light vanished from Sir Herbert's eyes, but his manner was slightly more urbane than when Ashenden was brought into the room. He rose and held out his hand. "Now, you did quite right to come and tell me this, Mr. Ashenden. I have been very remiss. It is inexcusable on my part to offend that inoffensive old gentleman, but I will do my best to repair my error. I will call at the American Embassy this afternoon." "But not in too great state, sir, if I may venture a suggestion." The ambassador's eyes twinkled. Ashenden began to think him almost human. "I can do nothing but in state, Mr. Ashenden. That is one of the misfortunes of my temperament." Then, as Ashenden was leaving, he added, "Oh, by the way, I wonder if you'd care to come to dinner with me tomorrow night, black tie, at 8:15. He did not wait for Ashenden's assent, but took it for granted, and with a nod of dismissal sat down once more at his great writing table.